Welcome, everyone. Uh, this is Konstantinos, and I'm recording this session for the conference. The title of the paper is Regional and Place-Based or Local Institutional Drivers of Practice Adoption. The study is about firms adopting the Forest Stewardship Council certificate. Okay. Now, this is work I do with Tobias Goessling. He's a German author. And I want to start by presenting you the agenda. The first thing I want us to do is look at the theoretical background. Um, the second thing is identifying the gap. So what is our contribution? Then we look at the research questions, um, and then the hypothesis, and then we look at the methodology and the analysis with the results. And then at the end, we have some points to discuss about the contribution of the paper. Okay. Now, FSC is the Forest Stewardship Council is a certificate that certifies that the wood and paper that we use actually comes from sustainable sources. So it is not wood that we have stolen from the Amazon or wood and paper that comes from illegal logging in any other place in the world. If you look at most paper products today, you will see FSC is a very common symbol certifying the sustainability of the paper we use. Here we're thinking about FSC as a practice, so something that firms do. When we think about a practice in management terms, we think about, innovative processes, managerial processes, or even specific tools like robotic surgery that firms use to improve their efficiency, whatever. But, from a sustainability point of view, when we think about practice, we think about something like FSC, so a certificate, a recycling process, or energy conservation procedures that we follow, something like that. And so the point is, we're looking at how practices like these diffuse, so how they get adopted. When we think about adoption, we think about uh, diffusion of these practices among firms or individuals in a very fast way, so a rapid diffusion process over a number of years or months. And that happens through some form of communication. So firms are able to observe each other or communicate about things, or maybe they interact with a community within which they are located, right? Um, and sometimes firms, of course, mimic each other. So there's a social acceleration effect in a sense that some firms may adopt some environmental certificate, but others may mimic that process. And that's what increases the diffusion rate. Okay. So this is the first thing in terms of theoretical background, the practice. Okay, the practice. We're thinking about the sustainability practice. It's a certificate, an environmental certificate that we're trying to understand. The second thing is, you may have seen the title, the second thing is what are institutions? So we're looking for some institutions that affect the diffusion rate of those environmental practices. And in broad terms, institutions are all the take it for granted assumptions in a society about how things are supposed to happen. So to give you some very simple examples, the handshake is an institution. Why? Because when you just go out to meet somebody, it is expected that you will shake hands. It's a standard thing. It's a very standard behavior, isn't it? But otherwise, we can think about institutions in a broader terms, like the whole educational system is an institution. We say that institutions function well in this country, in this society, so that the educational system is an institution, it's a positive institutional force, right? It is something that empowers people. By the same token, unemployment, the degree of unemployment is an institution. It's a negative institution, right? Or we could also think about institutions in the form of organizations. So the church is an institution, okay? So basically what institutional theory says, it's a theory in the sociology of organizations. What it says is that firms tend to comply. They comply, isn't it, with what institutions prescribe. So anytime some institution is very powerful in a specific industry or location, then firms will most likely adhere to what those institutions say. They will they will do what is expected of them. Just like when you shake hands, firms will do whatever the broader institutional setting prescribes or expects from them, right? So those are the two theoretical points we have to discuss before moving on. The first thing is, what is a practice? The practice is the FSC certificate, an environmental certificate. And then what can explain that the diffusion of that practice? It's a number of institutions like education, unemployment, economic conditions, whatever it is, right? So the institutions affect the way certain practices diffuse, okay? So there's a lot of studies about these two things, institutional theory, institutions affecting practice adoption and how certain practices diffuse, they get accepted by society. But one thing we don't quite know much about is geographical institutional drivers. Very surprisingly, very few people, I mean, almost nobody has looked at how institutions in a specific location, in a specific locality affect firm behavior. So we know that institutions like the church, or unemployment are very powerful across countries or in specific broad country market of products, settings. But how about specific geographical boundaries, if you know what I mean? So here we have basically three different things I want us to explore. One is whether firms observe regional institutions in an administrative region within a country. Okay, do firms observe regional institutions or not? The second thing is whether firms observe local institutions or not, and that local means in the city, in the place, exactly the postcode, the place where they're headquartered, where they're located. Okay, and the third thing is, do firms within a region actually observe local institutions more than regional ones? So maybe firms care about the broader regional institutions and the local institutions. Okay, but which of those is more important, the regional or the local institutions? That, we argue, that will depend on the distance of the organization from the country's capital. I will come to this in a minute. Okay, now let's think about local for a minute, local geographical institutional drivers. It's what we call place-based on the title of the paper. Think about it. In environmental issues, it's the physical landscape that surrounds a company that makes it want to care about the environment. So if you're located in a forest or close to a forest, you're more likely to care about environmental issues than if you're headquartered in the city center, right? That's the idea. Okay, let's just clarify a bit more what we're trying to do. Basically, we are using data from the whole of the European Union at the nudge 2 level. As you probably know, that's geographical regions that the European Union, the Eurostat, uses. And so here in the UK, we can see that there's a number of nudge 2 regions. Broad region, Southeast London, Greater London, East Midlands, West Midlands, and so forth. But now, those are the regions, but then we can break those down to specific locations. Okay, so the Southeast actually incorporates J1, J2, and J3 down here, right? So there is the regional level, and there is also something more local when it comes to geographical properties. Okay, and where firms are located, they could be within a region, but towards the edge of that region, or they could be at the center of that region, and they could be closer or further away from the country's capital, right? Okay, now let's look at the hypothesis, the specific hypothesis that we are proposing here based on those two different levels of analysis. Regional level, we say that we think that firms who have a lot of who face a lot of competition, there's a lot of competition density in a region, will most likely adopt the FSC certificate. Why? Because they will be afraid that if they don't do it, some other um, green, sustainable, responsible organizations will do that. Whereas if you don't have any competition in the region, who cares, right? So the first hypothesis about the fact that density, competitive density, pushes organizations towards being more ethical or appearing, seeming to be more ethical than others. So that would make them want to adopt the FSC certificate. Yeah. But on the other hand, if we think about the broader institutional setting, uh, we argue that if there's a lot of unemployment in a region, then firms are less likely to adopt FSC. Why? Because clearly the institutional setting is not very powerful. That region has a lot of problems to solve, economic and employment related problems, so that sustainability is not a first priority. Okay, so you have a very weak institutional setting that has a lot of unemployment issues. Firms will not want to adopt FSC. Yeah. So the first hypothesis about the market, the second hypothesis about the society, and the third hypothesis here is about the government. So here, what we're saying is that the government, spending money on environmental matters is a signal. It's a signal that the government, the country, should do more about the environment. So anytime the government spends money on that region, that should make organizations, private organizations, want to also do stuff about the environment. So that would make them more likely to adopt FSC, right? So we have three different questions here. One is about the market, the competition. The second is about the society, and the third one is about the government spending. Okay. So this is at the regional level. At the local level, as I said before, we want to see whether firms closer or further away from the country's capital within a region would tend to certify themselves more or less. So hypothesis 4A, B, and C refer to their effectively moderating processes, aren't they? Moderating processes refer to exactly those constructs, competitive density, unemployment, and government spending. But look, we say that H4A, the higher the distance of an organization's headquarters from a country's capital, the more negative the impact of regional competitive density on its decision to adopt the FSC certificate, right? So regions that are very far from the country's capital will not have that much of an impact on firms' decision to adopt the FSC certificate. The reason is that if you're closer to the capital, to the commercial and business center and legal center of the country, then you're more compelled by those institutional forces, right? They're more compelled to act responsibly. By the same token, hypothesis 4B says that the higher the distance of an organization's headquarters from a country's capital, the more negative the impact of regional unemployment to adopt on firms' decision to adopt FSC. Okay, and here this is interesting. Hypothesis 4C: the higher the distance of an organization's headquarters from the country's capital, the more positive the impact of regional government spending on its decision to adopt FSC. Now, here we have more negative here, more positive. Why? Because government spending in specific regions is usually designed for those specific regions, right? So think about it. The government doesn't want to just help London. They want to also help East Midlands. So any government intervention, government spending there sends a very powerful signal for that region. Okay, so obviously, regional, local businesses in that region will want to follow suit what the government does. I hope it is clear. So regionally, we argue that those are some three important institutions, but then we say, okay, but how far are those regions from the country's capital? Okay, so that we can understand what is their impact, their actual impact. So the conceptual framework of the study is like this: regional competition, regional unemployment, regional government spending affect FSC adoption, but those three independent variables are moderated by the distance of the company's headquarters from the capital city. Yeah, positive or negative way. Yeah. Okay, so what data do we have exactly? I gave the example of the UK before, not just two regions from the UK, but actually we had more than one country. We had data from the UK, from Holland, Germany, Italy, and France. There is 293 paper and paperboard companies that could adopt FSC over a period of 10 years, from the year 2000 to 2010, and those 5 countries have effectively 76 not 2 regions. That's the kind of data we have. So in total, we have 3,201 firm years, as we call them, and out of those is 122 unique events. Every time a firm adopts FSC, it drops from the sample, right? So as I said before, we want to see when and how, under what conditions companies adopt FSC, and for that we're doing an event history analysis, event history, right? The typical thing here is the dependent variable, which is 0, 1. Either you adapt FSC, that's a 1, or you don't adapt FSC, that's a 0. Okay, now we have discrete time data, so we use the log-log specification that is appropriate for this kind of analysis. We have a lot of control variables. So what might explain firms' adoption of FSC, firm resources, visibility, shareholders, other regional metrics like, the population of the region and so forth, right? Now, here's the results. If you look at what's happening, that's interesting. Here we see the 95% confidence interval when it comes to how those properties here have an impact on FSC adoption by distance in kilometers, right? And what we see is that firms very close or very far away from the country's capital tend to adopt FSC more than those in between, okay? And that is something that holds for regional competition as well as regional unemployment, okay? So in the case of regional government spending, it's more clear that firms far away, you see here, far away from the country's capital tend to adopt FSC more, exactly as we had predicted. I think it's a very interesting result, isn't it? That distance is very important. So the theoretical implications of the study are pretty clear, I think. Basically, we're testing whether the regional institutions matter, and we find that yes, they do. I mean, nobody has quite done that before. But then we also show that as the firm's distance from the capital increases, the interplay between regional and local levels start becoming a little bit more interesting. Okay, so regionally, overall, regional drivers are very important. Regional institutional drivers are very important, but within that region, firms very close to the country's capital, very far away from the country's capital, tend to adopt FSC more than those in the middle of the region, the administrative region. Okay. Now, managerial implications. Remote or isolated firms behave different than those closer to the capital or other major centers in that region, and so this is perhaps due to the fact that firms who are remote or very isolated tend to have monopolistic advantages, so they don't quite have to follow what institutions and stakeholders may tell them to do. They're far more independent, whereas firms who are not remote or isolated tend to comply more. That's the basic idea of the paper. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you.